The stench of wood smoke and something fouler drifted through the Virginia pines on that October morning in 1855, when the first search party found what remained of the Henderson family cabin. The taste of copper hung in the mountain air, like a warning no one had heeded in time. This is the story of how desperation, isolation, and the wounds of slavery created monsters in the hollows of Appalachia, and how those monsters turned their hunger back on the world that had cast them out. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed Blood Mountain, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that history tried to bury. And subscribe, because the truth about America's forgotten horrors deserves to be told. The Blue Ridge Mountains of 1855 Virginia were not the romanticized wilderness of modern imagination. The creak of wagon wheels on rutted dirt roads, the acrid bite of coal smoke from iron forges, and the rough bark of chestnut trees that dominated every ridge. These were the sensory markers of a landscape carved by industry and scarred by human ambition. In these hollows, where morning mist clung like spirits to the mountainsides, lived people the outside world preferred to forget. The Harpe family had been forgotten long before they became something to fear. Samuel Harpe stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years wielding an axe, but his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd seen his humanity stripped away, piece by piece. Born into bondage on a tobacco plantation near Richmond, he'd escaped in 1848 with his wife Ruth and their 3 adult children, Ezekiel, Micah, and their daughter Sarah. What happened during their years on the run, moving from mountain settlement to mountain settlement, would later be pieced together from the testimonies of those few brave enough to speak. From the journal of circuit preacher William Thornton, dated September 15, 1854, met with the Harpe family today at the edge of Grayson County. Something unsettling about them, though I cannot place what. The father speaks little, but when he does, there's a rage beneath his words that prayer seems unable to touch. The Harpes had tried to settle in 4 different mountain communities between 1849 and 1854. Each time, the pattern repeated itself with crushing predictability. Initial tolerance gave way to suspicion, suspicion to accusation, accusation to exile. Whether it was missing livestock, unexplained disappearances of travelers, or simply the discomfort that former slaves inspired in communities of poor whites scratching out subsistence livings, the result was always the same. The family would pack their meager possessions and disappear deeper into the mountains, further from civilization, closer to something that civilization couldn't name. By winter of 1854, they'd settled on what locals called Blood Mountain, a name that predated their arrival by decades, earned for the Cherokee blood spilled there during forced removals 20 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who bothered to think about it. The mountain that had swallowed one group of unwanted people now sheltered another. But the Harpes weren't just hiding anymore. Samuel had been a field hand for 32 years before his escape, but Ruth had worked in the plantation house. She knew how to read, how to plan, how to think beyond the immediate needs of survival. The children had grown to adulthood in a world that offered them nothing but cruelty, disguised as law, kindness disguised as possession, and freedom disguised as a bounty on their heads. Hunger changes people, but hunger, combined with fury, isolation, and the kind of generational trauma that seeps into bone marrow that creates something else entirely. Some hungers demand feeding. The first travelers started disappearing from the mountain passes in late winter of 1854, a tinker heading south to trade in North Carolina, a family of German immigrants seeking passage to Tennessee, a Methodist minister carrying Bibles to remote settlements. The disappearances followed no obvious pattern except geography. They all vanished, somewhere along the network of deer trails and logging roads that crisscrossed Blood Mountain. Local authorities, such as they were, attributed the missing persons to the dangers any mountain traveler faced. Bears, wolves, unexpected weather, bandits, the wilderness offered plenty of explanations that didn't require investigation or uncomfortable questions about who might be living in the places civilized people feared to go. But Sheriff Marcus Whitley of nearby Independence noticed something else in his handwritten reports from that period. Every disappearance coincided with sightings of smoke rising from the deep hollows of Blood Mountain, smoke that rose too thick and lingered too long to be coming from a simple cooking fire. What the good people of Grayson County didn't yet understand was that the Harpe family had moved beyond survival. They discovered something that their years of suffering had taught them about the nature of power, revenge, and the terrible intimacy of consumption. The mountain that sheltered them was about to become their hunting ground, and the society that had rejected them was about to learn what monsters it had created in its own image. The smoke that Sheriff Whitley observed wasn't just cooking fires. It was the beginning of a feeding that wouldn't end until the mountain itself ran red with the consequences of a nation's original sins, and a family's decision that if they couldn't find humanity in the world, they'd consume it instead. The blade glinted in the firelight as Ruth Harpe cleaned it for the third time that evening, her weathered hands steady despite what they'd just finished. Blood had a way of staining more than steel. It marked the soul, and once marked, there was no washing clean. Understanding how ordinary people become monsters matters because the same conditions that created the Harpies still exist today, hidden in the forgotten corners of society where desperation meets opportunity. The winter of 1854 had been brutal even by Blue Ridge standards. Snow fell 3 feet deep by January, trapping the Harpe family in their crude cabin on Blood Mountain's eastern slope. Game disappeared. Their meager supplies dwindled. But unlike other mountain families who might starve quietly or beg help from neighbors, the Harps had neighbors, and neighbors had things they needed. The crackle of frozen leaves underfoot, the metallic bite of air so cold it burned the lungs, and the smooth ice coating every surface. These were the sounds, smells, and textures that marked the morning Ruth Harpe made her first kill. Not in defense, not in desperation, but in calculated fury at a world that had given her family nothing but suffering. Thomas Whitlock was a traveling preacher, one of the circuit riders who brought salvation to remote settlements. He'd arrived at the Harpe cabin on February 9, 1855, seeking shelter from a sudden blizzard. What he found was a family that had moved beyond salvation into something Scripture had no words for. From Whitlock's final journal entry, dated February 9, 1855, Strange family. The woman reads better than most educated men I know, yet there's something in her eyes that makes me fear to close mine. Staying the night seems unwise, but the storm offers no choice. The storm lasted 3 days. Thomas Whitlock did not leave on the 4th. Ruth had been the first to suggest it not allowed, never allowed, but in the way she looked at their unexpected guest as he slept by their fire. Samuel understood immediately. This was no random stranger seeking shelter. This was Providence delivering exactly what they needed, a representative of the Christian society that had cast them out, helpless and alone in their domain. The revenge tasted better than either had imagined. What happened to Whitlock in that cabin would establish the pattern for everything that followed. The Harps didn't simply kill, they transformed their victims into sustenance, both physical and spiritual. Each death fed not just their bodies, but their growing conviction that they had found their true purpose on Blood Mountain. By spring of 1855, the family had consumed 4 travelers and begun making trips down the mountain, not to trade or seek supplies, but to hunt. They'd identified the problem with their previous approach. Waiting for victims to come to them meant long periods without fresh meat. Better to be proactive. The meat sustained them. Sarah, the daughter, proved most adept at this new form of hunting. Her beauty had survived their years of hardship, and mountain men were susceptible to a young woman in apparent distress. She'd approach isolated cabins with stories of being lost, separated from her family, desperate for help. The kindness of strangers became their primary source of food, but the harps had developed more sophisticated appetites. They'd begun selecting victims not just for convenience, but for symbolism. Preachers who'd ignored their pleas for charity, landowners who'd ordered them off their property, traders who'd cheated them in past dealings. Each death carried meaning beyond simple survival. Ezekiel, the eldest son, kept a journal of their hunts, not unlike a hunter's log, but with entries that revealed the evolution of their methodology. His handwriting, surprisingly educated for a former slave, documented their transition from desperate fugitives to something far more dangerous. From Ezekiel Harp's journal, dated April 21st, 1855, Mother says we must be particular about who we choose. Not just any meat will do. It must come from those who've earned their fate. The taste is sweeter when justice seasons the flesh. The local communities noticed the disappearances, but attributed them to the usual dangers of mountain life. Bears, falls, exposure. The wilderness provided convenient explanations for those who preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions about the people they'd driven from their towns. Sheriff Whitley began connecting patterns that others missed or chose to ignore. 7 missing persons in 6 months, all last seen traveling routes that skirted Blood Mountain. All healthy adults who should have been capable of surviving routine mountain travel. All from communities that had previously harbored runaway slaves. What the sheriff couldn't have known was that the Harps had begun keeping trophies, not just personal belongings, but preserved portions of their victims, strips of flesh dried like jerky, stored in the root cellar beneath their cabin. They developed preferences, techniques, rituals around their consumption that went far beyond simple cannibalism. This was communion with revenge itself. The family that had once begged for acceptance from mountain communities now saw themselves as judges, jury, and executioners for a society that had created them through cruelty and abandonment. Their hunger had evolved into something that fed on more than flesh. It consumed the very foundations of the civilization that had rejected them. But their appetite was about to lead them to a target that would change everything. The plantation where Samuel had been born into bondage, and the family that still owned the papers declaring him property. When the Harpies decided to return to Richmond County, they weren't planning just another hunt. They were planning a homecoming that would teach their former masters the true meaning of being consumed. The gates of Belmont Plantation creaked open at dawn on May 15, 1855, as if welcoming home a prodigal son. Samuel Harpy stood in the morning shadows, no longer the broken field hand who'd fled 7 years earlier, but something the plantation's elegant columns had never been designed to contain. This homecoming would test whether the civilized world could recognize the monsters it had created, or if it would remain willfully blind until the very end. The humid air of Richmond County carried the sweet rot of tobacco leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, and the familiar texture of red clay dust that had once coated Samuel's bare feet as he worked these same fields. But now, the Harpe family approached Belmont not as supplicants or property, but as predators, returning to a hunting ground that held both their origin story and their ultimate vindication. The plantation belonged to Colonel James Belmont, a man whose wealth had been built on the backs of 3 generations of enslaved families. His mansion, with its white columns and manicured gardens, represented everything the Harpies had been denied: comfort, security, the luxury of choosing who lived and who died. Ruth had spent weeks planning their approach. Unlike their mountain hunts, this required subtlety, patience, and an understanding of plantation social dynamics that only former house slaves possessed. She knew the rhythms of Belmont's daily life, the blind spots in the overseer's routines, the times when the main house stood most vulnerable. From a letter found in Colonel Belmont's papers, dated May 10, 1855, strange reports from the quarters about strangers asking questions. The field hands seem nervous, but they always do this time of year. Harvest preparations have everyone on edge. The family had been watching Belmont for 5 days before making contact, learning the new faces, identifying which of Samuel's former acquaintances still lived in the slave quarters. Many recognized him, despite the years and his transformation, but their reactions ranged from fearful silence to knowing nods that suggested some understood what he'd become. On the night of May 14th, Sarah approached the plantation's kitchen, playing her familiar role of lost traveler. The cook, an elderly woman named Patience, who'd known Samuel as a boy, initially welcomed her with characteristic plantation hospitality. Only when Sarah began asking specific questions about Colonel Belmont's whereabouts did Patience realize who she was dealing with. The old woman's disappearance went unnoticed for 12 hours, long enough for the Harps to establish themselves in the abandoned tobacco barn where Samuel had once been whipped for the crime of learning to read. Justice had its own appetite. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same barn where Samuel had been brutalized for seeking knowledge now sheltered his family as they planned their most elaborate hunt yet. The wooden posts still bore stains from punishments inflicted decades earlier, but now they would witness a different kind of justice. Colonel Belmont maintained meticulous records of his property, including detailed descriptions of every enslaved person who'd ever worked his land. Samuel's entry, written in the colonel's careful script, described him as strong back, quick mind, tendency toward insubordination, requires firm correction. The same attention to detail that had once cataloged human beings as livestock now worked against their former owner. Ruth had studied these records during her years in the main house, memorizing not just the layout of the plantation, but the personal habits of the Belmont family. She knew that the colonel took his morning coffee alone in the library. She knew that his wife visited the slave quarters every Tuesday to distribute medicine. She knew that their teenage son practiced violin in the music room each evening at 7 o'clock. Most importantly, she knew they would never suspect former property of being capable of sophisticated planning. The Belmonts had built their wealth by refusing to see enslaved people as fully human. This blindness, which had once protected their consciences, now left them defenseless against enemies they couldn't imagine their victims becoming. When Samuel appeared in Colonel Belmont's library on the morning of May 16th, the plantation owner's first reaction wasn't fear, but annoyance at the intrusion. "You can't be in here, boy," Belmont said without looking up from his ledger. "Find the overseer if you need work." Samuel's response came not in words, but in the sound of the library door closing with deliberate finality. Only then did Colonel Belmont look up and recognize the face he'd once owned. The recognition lasted exactly long enough for understanding to dawn, and for that understanding to transform into the kind of terror that Belmont had inflicted on others for 43 years. But terror, the Harps had learned, was just the appetizer. What happened in that library over the next 6 hours would be reconstructed later from the evidence left behind, evidence that suggested the Harps had finally found victims worthy of their most refined techniques. They'd had months to plan this particular meal, and they intended to savor every moment. But the plantation held more than just Colonel Belmont and his immediate family. 27 enslaved people still worked the land, men and women who'd known Samuel as boy and man, who'd watched him suffer and celebrated his escape. Their reaction to his return would determine whether the Harps' homecoming became a massacre or something far more complex. The sound of breaking glass echoed across Belmont's courtyard at 9:37 a.m., followed by a silence so complete that even the morning birds stopped singing. In the slave quarters, 27 people who'd spent their lives reading danger in every white man's expression now faced a different kind of threat entirely. What happened next would reveal how quickly victims can become complicit when the alternative is joining the condemned. The quarters at Belmont Plantation stretched in neat rows behind the main house, weathered cabins that housed families who'd worked this land for generations. The smell of wood smoke from morning cooking fires, the sound of children's voices reciting lessons, and the rough texture of homespun cloth hanging on lines created a scene of forced domesticity that masked decades of accumulated grievances. When Samuel Harpe emerged from the main house at 10:15 a.m., his hands stained with more than dirt, the entire community understood that their world had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Old Moses, who taught Samuel to carve when he was barely knee-high, was the first to approach. At 73, Moses had survived by knowing when to speak and when to disappear. But the sight of Samuel, covered in Colonel Belmont's blood, required a different kind of wisdom. "Boy," Moses whispered, using the word that had once diminished Samuel but now felt like a prayer. "What you done?" Samuel's answer came not in words, but in the way he looked back toward the main house, where smoke had begun rising from windows that shouldn't have been smoking. The message was clear. The old order had ended with Colonel Belmont's last breath. According to testimony later given to federal investigators, Samuel addressed the gathered community with a speech that lasted exactly 7 minutes. He spoke about justice, about debts paid in flesh, about the choice each of them now faced. They could run and spend their lives looking over their shoulders for bounty hunters and overseers. They could stay and face whatever authorities would eventually arrive. Or they could join the family that had finally found a way to make their oppressors pay. From the affidavit of Rebecca Johnson, former slave at Belmont Plantation, given September 3, 1855, Samuel, he wasn't the same boy who ran off 7 years back. Something in him had gone cold as winter ground. When he talked about eating the master's flesh, some folks got sick, but others nodded like they understood. The choice split the community in ways that revealed truths about human nature that most preferred to keep buried. Revenge feeds on witnesses. 12 people fled Belmont that morning, taking nothing but the clothes they wore and the terrible knowledge of what they'd seen. 8 remained, but refused to participate, gathering in the farthest cabin to pray and wait for whatever would come next. But 7 chose to follow the Harpies into a darkness that transformed them from victims into something else entirely. Among those 7 was Jeremiah, who'd been whipped alongside Samuel for learning to read. There was Dinah, whose daughter had been sold south 5 years earlier. There was young Tom, barely 18, whose father had been worked to death in the tobacco fields. Each carried wounds that the Harps understood better than any preacher's promise of eventual reward. The transformation didn't happen immediately. It began with small acts of complicity, helping to dispose of evidence, staying silent when asked direct questions, accepting food without asking its source. But Ruth Harpe, who understood human psychology better than she understood mercy, knew that partial guilt was more binding than chains. By May 20th, the expanded Harpe family had grown to 11 members, united not by blood, but by shared appetite for a justice that civilized society would never provide. They'd consumed not just Colonel Belmont, but his wife, his son, and the overseer who'd administered beatings with religious devotion. The plantation's records, maintained with slaveholder precision, now served a different purpose. Ruth used them to identify other landowners, other families who'd profited from the trade in human flesh. The Harpies had tasted individual revenge and found it insufficient. They wanted to feast on the entire system that had created them. But their expanded numbers brought new challenges. 11 people couldn't disappear into the mountains as easily as 5. They needed a base of operations, resources, and most critically, a way to move through Virginia society without attracting attention. What they created instead was something unprecedented in American history: a mobile community of former slaves who'd learned to hunt their former masters with the same systematic efficiency once used to hunt them. They'd become a living nightmare for the plantation class, the return of every cruelty they'd inflicted, transformed, and magnified. The question wasn't whether authorities would eventually track them down. But how many more plantations would burn before that reckoning arrived? And whether any of those who'd witnessed their transformation would survive long enough to tell the complete story of what happened when America's original sin developed an appetite for revenge. The wagon rolled through Richmond County's morning mist on May 21st, 1855, carrying what appeared to be a family of free blacks heading north to find work. No one looked twice at the covered cargo or questioned why they traveled only at dawn and dusk, when shadows hid more than they revealed. This invisibility would become the Harps' greatest weapon and reveal how a society built on oppression creates its own blind spots. The dusty creak of wagon wheels on packed earth, the sweet stench of tobacco curing in distant barns, and the rough texture of hemp rope securing their covered load. These sensory details marked the Harps' transformation from isolated mountain clan to something far more dangerous. A mobile network of hunters who understood exactly how to exploit the prejudices of their prey. Ruth Harpe had spent her years in the plantation house, learning more than just how to read and write. She'd absorbed the social codes that governed interactions between whites and free blacks, the unspoken rules that determined who could travel where, when, and with what questions asked. Now that knowledge served a purpose its original teachers never intended. The expanded group had divided into 3 smaller units, each taking different routes through Virginia's plantation country. Samuel led one group north, toward Fredericksburg. Ezekiel headed west into the Blue Ridge foothills. Ruth commanded the central unit, moving through the heart of tobacco country, where her intelligence and planning skills could identify the most vulnerable targets. Their method had evolved beyond simple opportunistic hunting. Using plantation records stolen from Belmont, Ruth had created what amounted to a target list slaveholders, whose cruelties were documented in their own meticulous handwriting. Overseers whose brutality was legendary among the enslaved communities, traders who'd separated families for profit. From a letter discovered in Ruth Harper's possessions, dated May 18th, 1855. The ledgers tell stories their writers never meant to preserve. Every lashing recorded, every family separated, every child sold. They kept such careful accounts of their sins. But the Harps had discovered something that made their campaign far more effective than random violence. They weren't operating in isolation. The network of enslaved and recently freed blacks throughout Virginia had become their intelligence system, providing information about targets, safe houses, and escape routes. The moral complexity of this cooperation revealed uncomfortable truths about how oppression creates its own resistance. Many who aided the Harps never participated directly in their hunts, but they provided food, shelter, warnings about authorities, and most critically, silence when questioned by white investigators. This wasn't simple criminal collaboration. It was the infrastructure of revenge that slavery itself had created. Benjamin Rawlings discovered this network's effectiveness on May 22nd, when his plantation near Hanover experienced what authorities would later describe as a coordinated attack. Rawlings, known throughout the county for his use of hunting dogs to track runaway slaves, found himself tracked by predators who understood his methods better than he did. The attack began at midnight, with the systematic poisoning of his dogs, not killed, but incapacitated with herbs that enslaved people had long used to treat their own ailments. By 2 a.m., every white person on the Rawlings plantation had simply disappeared, leaving behind only evidence of carefully planned abductions. What happened to Rawlings and his family over the following 3 days would be reconstructed from testimony given by terrified survivors in neighboring counties. The Harps hadn't simply killed their victims. They'd subjected them to the same systematic dehumanization that slavery itself represented. Hunger becomes justice. The efficiency of these operations revealed something that authorities were reluctant to acknowledge. The Harpies possessed intelligence networks, logistical support, and operational security that rivaled military campaigns. They moved through Virginia like an army that fed on its enemies, growing stronger with each successful hunt. By late May, plantation owners throughout central Virginia had begun receiving anonymous letters written in Ruth's educated hand. The messages were brief but specific, detailed accounts of crimes committed against named enslaved individuals, followed by simple declarations of coming judgment. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical attacks. Sheriff departments in 7 counties began coordinating their responses, but they faced a fundamental problem. Their investigations depended on cooperation from the same communities that were actively supporting the Harpeys. Enslaved people claimed to see nothing, know nothing, remember nothing. Free blacks provided alibis for each other that couldn't be broken under questioning. The authorities found themselves hunting phantoms who left behind only empty plantation houses and rumors that spread faster than their ability to verify them. What they didn't yet understand was that the Harps had evolved beyond simple revenge. They'd become something unprecedented in American history, a self-sustaining resistance movement that literally consumed the system it opposed. Each successful hunt provided both the physical nourishment and psychological satisfaction needed to plan the next operation. But their success was about to attract attention from sources more dangerous than local sheriffs. Federal authorities who understood that the Harpeys represented a threat to the entire economic foundation of the South. And among those authorities was a man whose own family history would make their final confrontation intensely personal. The telegraph key clicked out its urgent message at 4:17 a.m. on June 2, 1855, carrying news that would transform a regional nightmare into a national crisis. Federal Marshal Robert Thornfield received the coded transmission in his Washington office, unaware that his own family's plantation records were already marked in Ruth Harp's stolen ledgers. Understanding how governments respond to threats that challenge their foundational systems reveals why some monsters are created by the very authorities meant to stop them. The marble halls of the Federal Marshal's office in Washington, D.C., echoed with the sharp click of boot heels, carried the acrid smell of burning telegraph paper, and bore the smooth texture of polished surfaces that had witnessed countless decisions about who lived and who died in America's expanding territories. But the crisis briefing that assembled at dawn on June 2nd addressed a threat unlike any the federal government had previously confronted. Marshal Thornfield spread the reports across his mahogany desk with hands that trembled slightly despite 20 years of federal service. 7 plantations attacked in 3 weeks, 42 confirmed deaths, property damage exceeding $200,000. But the numbers told only part of the story that had reached President Franklin Pierce's personal attention. The real crisis wasn't the deaths. It was the systematic nature of the attacks and the growing evidence of widespread support among Virginia's enslaved population. If the Harpey model spread to other states, the economic foundation of the South would collapse within months. From Marshal Thornfield's official report, dated June 2, 1855, these aren't random acts of violence, but coordinated military operations executed by individuals with intimate knowledge of plantation security, local geography, and community networks. We're dealing with organized insurrection. Thornfield had been chosen to lead the federal response because of his reputation for handling delicate situations involving slavery and federal authority. What his superiors didn't know was that his family owned Thornfield Manor, a tobacco plantation just 30 miles from the Harpey's current area of operations. The irony would prove fatal. The federal investigation revealed disturbing patterns that local authorities had missed or ignored. The Harps weren't simply killing slaveholders, they were systematically documenting their victims' crimes through stolen records, creating what amounted to a legal case for their actions. Ruth's meticulous notes read like indictments, complete with evidence, witness testimony, and detailed accounts of punishments inflicted. This wasn't madness or random violence. It was justice administered outside the legal system, and that made it far more dangerous than simple criminal behavior. Thornfield assembled a task force of 12 federal marshals and 43 local volunteers. supported by 2 companies of Army infantry from Fort Monroe. The military response represented the largest federal law enforcement operation in Virginia since Nat Turner's rebellion 24 years earlier. But the Harps had advantages that traditional military thinking couldn't address. They moved through a population that saw them as liberators rather than criminals. They struck targets that most enslaved people wanted destroyed. They left behind evidence that documented systemic cruelties their victims preferred to keep hidden. Most critically, they understood their enemies better than their enemies understood them. The first major engagement between federal forces and the Harpe network occurred on June 8th near Mechanicsville, when a patrol led by Deputy Marshal Charles Fleming surrounded what they believed was the main Harpe camp. The ensuing battle lasted 4 hours and ended with 7 federal casualties, but no Harpe bodies among the dead. The ambush had been too sophisticated, too well coordinated for a family of escaped slaves. Intelligence suggested the Harps had recruited military veterans among the free black population, men who'd served in the War of 1812 and understood tactics that regular law enforcement couldn't counter. Justice feeds on expertise. Fleming's after-action report described fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate every federal move, that struck from multiple directions simultaneously, that disappeared into terrain they knew better than the men hunting them. The Harps weren't just running, they were maneuvering. By mid-June, the psychological impact of the Harpe campaign had begun affecting plantation operations throughout central Virginia. Slaveholders demanded federal protection. Overseers refused to work isolated properties. The price of slaves dropped 20% as buyers worried about purchasing future victims rather than laborers. The economic disruption was exactly what Ruth Harpe had calculated. She understood that slavery survived through the illusion of white control over black bodies. By systematically destroying that illusion, the Harpies were attacking the foundation of Southern prosperity. But Marshal Thornfield had begun developing countermeasures that exploited the Harpies' greatest strength: their connection to enslaved communities. If the network that protected them could be turned against them, the federal government could end their campaign without addressing the underlying grievances that fueled it. The trap he was preparing would force the Harpes to choose between their mission and their allies, a choice that would reveal whether their appetite for revenge was stronger than their humanity. The answer would determine not just their fate, but the future of federal authority in a nation where the line between justice and terrorism had become impossible to define. The trap Thornfield is setting should involve using the network against them, and this should reveal moral complexities. This section should show the trap being sprung and its consequences. The rope bit deep into Sarah Harpe's wrists as federal marshals dragged her into the basement of Thornfield Manor at 11:43 p.m. on June 19, 1855. Her screams echoed through the same stone chambers where Marshal Thornfield's own slaves had once been punished for the crime of seeking freedom. What happened next would prove that in the pursuit of monsters, even federal authority could become monstrous, and force the Harps to confront the true cost of their campaign. The damp stone walls of Thornfield Manor's basement carried the metallic smell of old chains, the musty odor of decades-old straw, and the rough texture of carved initials left by prisoners who'd never seen daylight again. Marshal Thornfield had chosen his family's plantation deliberately, knowing that using enslaved people as bait would draw the Harpies into terrain where federal forces held every advantage. The plan had taken 2 weeks to execute. Using informants among the free black population, men and women coerced through threats to their own families. Thornfield had spread word that a group of enslaved people planned to escape from his plantation on the night of June 19th. The information included details about weak security, hidden routes, and most critically, evidence that Thornfield kept detailed records of his cruelties in his private study. Sarah had been selected to scout the plantation because of her proven ability to move undetected through hostile territory. What she found instead was a carefully orchestrated ambush that had been waiting for precisely the right bait. From Marshal Thornfield's tactical notes, dated June 15, 1855, the target's emotional attachments represent their primary vulnerability. They cannot resist opportunities to rescue enslaved individuals, even when tactical wisdom suggests retreat. The trap revealed something crucial about both hunter and prey. Thornfield understood that the harpist's greatest strength, their connection to enslaved communities, could become their fatal weakness if properly exploited. But what he didn't anticipate was how far the remaining Harpe family members would go to reclaim one of their own. Ruth Harpe received news of Sarah's capture at dawn on June 20th through a network that federal forces had failed to completely penetrate. Her response demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed even her enemies. Rather than attempt a direct rescue, she began systematically targeting every person who'd contributed to the trap. The names were easy to obtain. Federal investigations require documentation, and documentation creates paper trails that former house slaves know how to follow. Within 48 hours, Ruth had identified 12 informants, traced their family connections, and begun what she called educational visits to demonstrate the consequences of cooperation with federal authorities. Betrayal has its own flavor. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly. Thornfield had expected the harpist to attempt a rescue operation that federal forces could repel with superior numbers and firepower. Instead, he found himself defending not just his prisoner, but an entire network of collaborators who'd believed federal protection was stronger than Harpe vengeance. By June 22nd, 3 informants had disappeared entirely. 2 others were found with evidence that the harpist techniques had become more sophisticated and more personal. The message was clear. Federal authority couldn't protect those who betrayed the network that had sheltered runaway slaves for decades. The escalation forced Thornfield to make a choice that would define both his career and his conscience. He could release Sarah and admit federal failure, or he could use her as bait for an operation that would require sacrificing the very people his trap had been designed to protect. He chose the operation. The final phase of Thornfield's plan transformed his family's plantation into a fortress designed to withstand siege. 2 companies of infantry established defensive positions around the main house. Federal marshals occupied every building, with sightlines to potential approach routes. The basement where Sarah was held became the center of a killing ground designed to eliminate the Harpe threat permanently. But Ruth Harpe had spent months studying federal tactics, military procedures, and the psychological profiles of the men hunting her family. Her counter-strategy relied on understanding something that Marshal Thornfield's tactical manuals couldn't address: the moral complexity of using enslaved people as weapons in a war they hadn't chosen to fight. On the night of June 24th, as federal forces prepared for an assault that never came, Ruth instead targeted the plantation's slave quarters. Not to rescue Sarah, but to offer every enslaved person on Thornfield's property the same choice she'd given to the community at Belmont: run, hide, or join the hunt. The choice split the quarters in ways that revealed truths about resistance, complicity, and survival that no federal manual had prepared Thornfield to handle. Some fled into the night. Others barricaded themselves in their cabins to wait for whatever would come. But 16 chose to join Ruth Harpe in an operation that would transform a rescue mission into something far more dangerous. What followed would test whether federal authority could maintain control when the very foundations of that authority, the cooperation of oppressed populations, turned against it. The battle for Thornfield Manor wouldn't just determine Sarah's fate, but whether the United States government could defeat enemies who understood American society's contradictions better than America understood itself. The first explosion shattered the manor's east wing at 3:27 a.m. on June 25th, sending federal marshals scrambling through smoke-filled corridors that had become a maze of death. Marshal Thornfield pressed his back against the library door, listening to screams that echoed from rooms where his own childhood memories lived alongside the sounds of systematic slaughter. This final confrontation would reveal whether civilized society could survive when its foundational hypocrisies became weapons in the hands of those it had brutalized. The acrid smell of black powder, the wet slap of bare feet on polished hardwood, and the splintered texture of door frames destroyed by homemade explosives. These sensory details marked the transformation of Thornfield Manor from federal stronghold into charnel house. Ruth Harpay had learned more than domestic skills during her years serving in plantation houses. She'd absorbed lessons about architecture, security, and the blind spots that wealth created in the minds of those who possessed it. The assault began not with direct attack, but with psychological warfare designed to fracture federal coordination. At midnight, the screaming started from the slave quarters, not cries of pain, but coordinated wails that rose and fell like signals, carrying across the plantation grounds in patterns that federal forces couldn't decode, but that communicated precise tactical information to Ruth's expanded network. By 2 a.m., Marshal Thornfield realized that his defensive positions had been compromised from within. Enslaved people who'd lived at the manor for decades possessed knowledge that no military engineer could anticipate. Hidden passages between walls, forgotten root cellars, access routes that connected buildings through underground tunnels originally designed for hiding valuable property during raids. From the final dispatch of Deputy Marshal Charles Fleming, timed at 3:15 a.m., they're in the walls. Repeat. Hostiles have penetrated the main structure through routes not shown on any blueprint. Request immediate reinforcement. No reinforcements would arrive in time. The battle for Thornfield Manor lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, but its outcome was determined in the first 30 seconds, when Ruth Harp's forces demonstrated that they understood federal tactics better than federal forces understood plantation architecture. Every defensive position had been anticipated. Every escape route had been blocked. Every assumption about how enslaved people would behave under pressure had been systematically shattered. But the true horror of the Thornfield massacre wasn't the tactical brilliance of the assault. It was what Ruth Harpay did with her victory. Rather than simply rescue Sarah and withdraw, she transformed the manor into a theater where decades of accumulated grievances could be addressed with methodical precision. Each federal marshal was subjected to the same systematic degradation that slavery had inflicted on millions. Each local volunteer experienced the same helplessness that characterized life under the lash. And Marshal Thornfield himself became the centerpiece of a demonstration that would echo through Virginia society for generations. Vengeance demands witnesses. The federal commander, who'd used enslaved people as bait, discovered what it felt like to become prey in a hunt where the rules had been written by his victims. Ruth Harpay spent 47 minutes in Thornfield's library, surrounded by the books that had educated her and the records that documented her family's suffering, explaining to the federal marshal exactly how justice would be administered. The explanation was interrupted frequently by sounds from other parts of the manor, where the rest of Thornfield's forces were learning that mercy was a luxury their victims had never been offered. By dawn of June 26th, Thornfield Manor stood empty, except for evidence of what happened when America's foundational contradictions finally consumed the society that had created them. The federal response had been neutralized, not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of the system it had been designed to protect. But Ruth Harpay had made a strategic error that would prove fatal. In her desire to send a message that would paralyze the federal response, she'd left behind evidence of her next target documents that revealed the Harpay network planned to strike at the heart of the slave trade itself. Richmond's main auction house, where families were separated and human beings sold like livestock. The attack would require coordination among dozens of participants, precise timing, and resources that could only be gathered in one place, the abandoned ruins of Blood Mountain, where the Harpay family's transformation had begun. Federal authorities might have failed to protect Thornfield Manor, But they now knew exactly where their enemies would gather for their final, most ambitious hunt. The trap that would end the Harpy campaign was already being prepared by forces that understood the one thing Ruth Harpy had never learned. Sometimes, the most effective way to destroy monsters is to become monstrous yourself. The muzzle flash lit up Blood Mountain's eastern slope at 5:41 a.m. on July 7, 1855, revealing Ruth Harpy's face for the last time as federal bullets found their mark. Her final words, spoken to Sarah as smoke cleared from the family's original cave hideout, would define how history remembered the clan that had turned America's original sin into literal consumption. This ending would prove that some hungers are too dangerous to survive, and that the society which creates monsters must eventually choose between destroying them or being destroyed in return. The morning air on Blood Mountain carried the sharp crack of rifle fire, the sulfurous stench of gunpowder, and the smooth texture of blood-soaked leaves that had witnessed the final act of America's most systematic revenge campaign. Federal forces, led by Colonel Marcus Webb after Marshal Thornfield's death, had surrounded the Harpy Network's gathering point with 400 soldiers and enough firepower to level half the mountain. But the siege that began at dawn on July 6th had revealed something that military commanders hadn't anticipated. The Harps weren't planning to defend their position. They were planning to die fighting, and they intended to take as many federal soldiers with them as possible. The network had grown to 37 members by the time they returned to Blood Mountain, former slaves, free blacks, and even a handful of white abolitionists who'd been radicalized by witnessing the Harps campaign. What they'd created wasn't just a criminal organization, but a revolutionary cell that understood exactly how much damage 37 determined people could inflict on a society built on oppression. From Colonel Webb's final report, dated July 15th, 1855, they fought like demons, but organized demons. Every position was prepared for maximum casualties. Every retreat was calculated to draw our forces into killing zones. These weren't desperate fugitives. They were soldiers fighting a war we didn't know we were in. The battle lasted 18 hours and cost the federal government 112 casualties, more than any single engagement since the Mexican War. But the true cost couldn't be measured in bodies alone. Ruth Harpy had spent her final weeks documenting everything the network had learned about federal weaknesses, plantation vulnerabilities, and the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. These documents, hidden throughout Blood Mountain's cave system, would eventually surface in locations from Alabama to Maryland, inspiring copycat organizations that federal authorities would spend decades trying to eliminate. The final confrontation took place in the same cave where the original Harpy family had spent their first winter on Blood Mountain. Samuel, Ruth, and their surviving children had chosen to make their last stand in the place where their transformation began, surrounded by the bones of their earliest victims and the trophies they'd collected from 7 years of systematic hunting. But Sarah Harpy, the daughter who'd proven most skilled at luring victims, had been captured 3 weeks earlier during a reconnaissance mission that went wrong. Her execution by federal forces on July 4th had been the final insult that transformed the Harps' planned retreat into a suicide mission designed to extract maximum revenge from their pursuers. Death feeds on irony. When federal forces finally breached the cave's defenses at dawn on July 7th, they found evidence of what the Harpy network had become during their years on Blood Mountain. The walls were carved with names not of victims, but of slaveholders, overseers, and federal officials marked for future elimination. Maps showed plantation locations throughout Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. Detailed plans outlined attacks that would have crippled the South's slave-based economy within months. Most disturbing were Ruth's final writings, discovered in a leather-bound journal clutched in her dead hands. The entries revealed a woman who'd moved beyond personal revenge into something approaching to religious mission. A belief that cannibalism wasn't just survival, but communion with a justice that civilized society couldn't Provide. From Ruth Harpe's final journal entry, dated July 6, 1855. They call us monsters, but we are only what they made us. Every bite of their flesh is a prayer answered. Every scream is a hymn to the God they taught us to worship through pain. The federal response to the Harpe Network's elimination went far beyond simple law enforcement. The caves were sealed with explosives. The entire eastern slope of Blood Mountain was declared off-limits to civilian access. Official records of the campaign were classified and wouldn't be released for 70 years. But the silence couldn't contain what the Harpies had unleashed. Within months of the Blood Mountain siege, similar organizations appeared in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama. Former slaves who'd heard whispered stories of the family that had learned to hunt their hunters began forming their own networks, adopting tactics that federal authorities recognized but couldn't predict. The Harpe model systematic revenge executed through cannibalistic consumption had proven too effective to die with its creators. Colonel Webb's classified recommendation to President Pierce was stark in its assessment. The Harpe Network represented a fundamental threat to federal authority because it transformed the foundational violence of slavery into a weapon that enslaved populations could wield against their oppressors. Eliminating the original network solved nothing if the underlying conditions that created them remain unchanged. The recommendation was ignored. The conditions remained unchanged. And in the mountains of Appalachia, where smoke still rises from fires that burn too long and too hot for simple cooking, some say the Harpe legacy never truly ended. It just learned to hide better. Modern hikers on Blood Mountain sometimes report finding carved names on cave walls, names that don't match any historical records, but seem to follow patterns that Ruth Harpe would have recognized. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.